All right, hello everybody. Today I've got for you something I kind of called it a side on jargon. Maybe I'll think of a better title when I'm actually putting the video together. But I kind of wanted to talk a little bit about jargon in fiction, especially, and how it can be a good thing in some cases, and it can be a moderate or not moderate, but like a neutral thing, and also it can be used in kind of negative ways in fiction. So I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that and kind of try to break it down a little bit. Hopefully this will be a pretty quick one. So, for the purposes of this video, how am I defining jargon? Basically, the typical definition of jargon, kind of the dictionary definition of jargon, without looking it up, is technical terminology or high-level language that's special to a particular area of study. So, like as a physicist, I might know a lot of jargon about lasers, and I might say, oh, this is Q switch, this is a femtosecond pulse laser, this is a nanosecond pulse laser, this is ultra fast, this is these atoms are ultra cold, this is a Bose-Einstein condensate. There are a lot of words that just because of my area of study that I could point at and say, well, these words are jargon. These are words that the average person doesn't know, but a person in my field probably would, right? So that's kind of like the dictionary definition of jargon. And there's a lot of, of course, engineers, dentists, doctors, pharmacists, linguists, every kind of area of study has its own jargon. And generally speaking, the average layman is not aware of that jargon unless they're an interested party that studies that area of study, studies that area of study with some amount of fervor, right? Like you'll find more jargon in a peer-reviewed journal article than you will in, say, popular mechanics or popular science, right? So that's kind of the dictionary definition of jargon, but I'm going to add something to it just for the purposes of fiction, which is the use of made-up or foreign language words in fiction that is pointed at a particular language fluent audience. And so you might even go so far to say, and there might be some audiences that are going to be expected to be fluent in multiple languages. Like if you think about Tolstoy's War and Peace, right? That's written in a combination of French and Russian. And, say what you like, that is to say, you feel however you like about the plight of the peasants in 1800s Russia. But, the people who were the audience for the book, the nobility, were going to be people who were both fluent in Russian and French. And so it kind of worked for them. But if you went, 50, 100 years later, the average Russian reader wouldn't be fluent in French, perhaps. Or there might be a decent number of them who are. And so, for instance, in the copy of War and Peace that I read part of, I didn't finish it before I ran out of library time, but putting that aside, the translator noted that for the French parts of the book there were translations in Russian in the original Tolstoy as well. It's kind of a clumsy way to do things, where you'll see a big block of text and you're like, okay, I have to go to the footnote. Okay, I have to go to the footnote. Okay, I have to go to the footnote. But a good chunk of Tolstoy's audience probably would have understood enough French to read the basic French stuff that was in the book. But generally speaking, if you're talking about like an English-speaking audience, Americans are infamously monolingual kind of thing. If you're going to include a lot of foreign words or foreign language in there that you're not going to necessarily expect your reader to understand, like if it were a book where the audience was a particular group of like if it were a book that were talking about the adventures of a Polish American, and it was kind of marketed towards Polish Americans, right? Then maybe you could get away with more Polish words in the book than otherwise, right? But this is something that's kind of determined by audience, just as it is with technical jargon. That is, certain things will be technical jargon to a layman if I'm talking about physics, as opposed to talking to a group of physicists. So, kind of took a little longer to define that than I hoped, but anyway, working with that definition, let's split jargon in fiction into 3 categories, and then split each of those into multiple subcategories. Sometimes jargon is necessary. Sometimes it is an integral part of the fiction that you are writing. Sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're writing speculative fiction, whether it be fantasy or science fiction or something else, and you've got things in there that just don't exist in reality, or they might exist in reality, but they're not known to the average person. So sometimes you just need that precision of description, right? An example of this would be in On the Beach, right? I did a review of On the Beach, and one of the things that is important to the plot of that book is the cobalt bomb, right? And so the average person would not know what a cobalt bomb is reading that book, but it's a term that they could go look up and say, okay, this is what it means, this is what it does, this is why it has the effects that it has, this is why it's important and vital, in fact, to the way that story plays out. And it's used only a few times in the book itself, and just to kind of make the point that this is what we're facing, right? Another good example would be psychohistory in the Foundation series, right? It is a school of thought that has some of its own vocabulary. It has its own applications and places where it doesn't apply, right? Like in Asimov's psychohistory, you cannot predict the individual actions of a particular person, but when you're dealing with a billion people, then things become predictable again. That's the kind of idea of psychohistory, which I hope I'm getting that term right. But if you've seen if you saw my Foundation review, you'll know what I'm talking about, and hopefully I got it right. There's other cases where jargon is necessary, where there's like unique or novel fictional constructs. And a great example of that, for instance, in Dune, which I just finished reading, is the stillsuit. And this is an extra interesting example because stillsuit is not just a unique novel fictional construct that's integral to that world and that setting. It's also, the name of it is also made from a compound of two existing words, or you could do more existing word compound if you wanted to, but the point is that one of the good things about the name stillsuit is that the reader can break it down from its constituent parts and say, this is a suit that acts as a still for my body's moisture, right? In Raymond Feist's fiction, in his Midkemia series, they have lesser and greater path magic. That's another example of a unique or novel fictional construct that is important and vital to the story. And therefore, you kind of need that jargon. And you need to make sure that the reader understands that jargon. Sometimes jargon is optional but adds flavor. There's a lot of examples of this. You can think of almost any proper name that is not just like a plain English, heritage name in books. A good example would be, and I'm probably going to get the pronunciation wrong, but there's episodal in the Doomsday Recon book that I read a little while ago, right? You could have a guy of German heritage named, John Wilson. It's your fiction. You could write it that way if you wanted to, but it would make more sense if his name was something that maybe might be a little bit harder for the average English reader to pronounce. And you can justify that. You could say, oh yeah, he took the name John Wilson when he moved here or something like that, which is something that has happened in history as well. But there's a good reason why you would have him have a German name, because he's a German character. There's also things that you add that are like cultural artifacts or phenomena that are specific to your world building that, again, are kind of optional but can add flavor, right? So one of the things I've got back into recently is Daggerfall, the second Elder Scrolls game, and the one that I find most compelling. I just finally picked up the latest version of Daggerfall Unity and started playing around with mods for the first time. I kind of go back to that game every couple of years and walk around in that gigantic, procedurally generated, but still interesting world. But in that game, right, in that game world, there's a whole bunch of gods and mythical terms. There's even and those are all like unique or novel fictional constructs that are integral to the world building. Fair enough. But there are things that they do, like having different names for months, or having different special names for holidays, which you could get away without having, but what they do is they add a little bit of depth to the setting, to the world building, without making the player or the reader understand or memorize too much. Generally speaking, the month names in that game are a couple of English words, and they kind of hint at what part of the year that month represents. Like I think there's like Sun's Rest is like I think the last month of fall kind of thing. There's also, if you've ever read any of the BattleTech fiction, right? There's stuff like there's a special way of speaking that the clans in BattleTech have, where they say like "af" and "neg" and stuff like that, and that is entirely optional, right? Like the reason that they do that is because an earlier author decided that they were going to have these weird particular like figures of speech. But at the same time, what it does is it adds a little bit of interestingness to the setting. It adds a little bit of exoticness too, and a little bit of, as long as it's not too intrusive, it's not that big of a deal. And as long as you don't have to memorize too many weird things, then, it's not too difficult. Again, optional, but kind of nice to have. However, there are times where I think authors use jargon to kind of dupe the reader in one of a variety of ways. One of them is where like large quantities of foreign language are used, and I'm not sure what the idea behind this is. Like, part of me wants to say it's like the author saying, "Look at me, I know this language," kind of thing, kind of like an ego thing. But what the effective result of this is that the reader sees this sentence in something that he doesn't understand, and so he has to stop, and he has to look around for context clues or for someone else to translate it a few lines down, kind of thing. This is one of the complaints I had with the book The Widow's Son that I reviewed a couple of months ago, where it was intrusive enough that like I would have to stop and be like, wait, what is he saying? Is it somewhere there? Can I get it from context? Something like that. And generally speaking, you don't want your reader to stop, right? You want your reader to keep going, to be like, ooh, I want to turn, I want to turn, I want to turn, I want to turn. And, if you do something that makes them go, you're kind of hamstringing yourself as an author. And so like, and this is something that, in a limited way would apply to like War and Peace itself, right? One of the great classics of literature is that, well, there's a bunch of stuff that's written in a different language, and so like the experience is very like choppy in a way, especially in those early chapters where it's like, here's 4 paragraphs in French, and you're like, oh, please stop. And then you have to go and you have to look at the smaller font at the bottom and be like, it's very irritating. That's one of those cases where it doesn't even really make sense from an author's perspective. Like, what you're doing is you're just making the reader dislike you. And so that should be avoided in general, I would say. There are other times where the author is trying to kind of pull one over on the reader. For example, there's cases where like perfectly reasonable English terms exist for something, but the author chooses a weird foreign language version of that term just to kind of sound cool. Or sound exotic or whatever, and it's really kind of just a ruse. Like, oh, that's just, it's just a cat, right? I mean, we're using the Hindi word for cat, but it's just a cat, kind of thing. A good example of this would be, it's kind of a meme, right? But there's a meme picture of a translation of Death Note, where there's the thought bubble, and I think it's Light thinking about something, and Light as a character's name in a Japanese show is kind of a funny thing by itself, but like the translator decided to be especially pretentious as well, because he translated a sentence as all according to Keikaku, and then at the bottom there's like Keikaku means plan. It's like, well, you could have just said all according to plan and then not make people dart their eyes around in random ways. This is kind of like, this is a case of the translator trying to make himself sound like, oh, this word has special layers. It just doesn't. There's nothing too special there that you don't get from the word plan. And then the third case that I wanted to talk about a little bit is when authors try to make themselves sound like their setting or their world building or their, thematic elements are especially deep, but they're not. And they do things like picking names out of a famous, piece of literature, in order to kind of like make people say, "Ooh, this is super deep," and there's so much thought goes into it. When in reality, it's just kind of a very basic plot that doesn't really have a lot of that kind of touches on a lot of issues, but doesn't really cover any of them in any particular depth. This is the impression that I have from my experience with the anime Neon Genesis Evangelion, right? Like, I know a lot of people that were like, "Oh, it's so deep" and stuff. And it's like, I watched the show, right? And I'm like, well, there's a lot of, like, when they were naming things, they decided to throw darts at a Bible. Sure, whatever. But that's not evidence of depth, right? It has to actually, like, lock into the actual setting, to the world building, to the characters. And we're dealing with a bunch of characters that are not at all connected to any of that folklore, mythology, and yet all these things are named after this thing. It just doesn't really seem to fit very well. I don't know, that's kind of my... I remember a lot of people telling me that, like, "Oh, this show is so deep," and I watched it's just a pretty basic science fiction show with, it touches on scientific hubris, but doesn't really go very deep with it. It touches on like intrigue and conspiracy, but it doesn't really do anything particularly deep with that, etc., etc., etc. And so, this is kind of one of my fears whenever I'm reading a book where I find a lot of, like, names that are from, like, famous myths or other famous books or famous whatever, right? It's like, oh, is this author just going to kind of spit big, goofy words at me in hopes that I will believe that this is a really deep story with, complex thematic elements? And usually it's not. So, lessons to learn. As a writer, what should you do when you're dealing with jargon in a text? There's a few questions that you can ask yourself to help make it so that your jargon is used for a good purpose, or good purposes, as opposed to using it to befuddle or dupe the reader. Question 1. Is this jargon necessary? Is it an integral part of your actual world building, of your setting, of your characters? Is it something that explains the heritage of a thing? Is it something that exists only in your fictional world, and so you need a special word for it? Is it something that connects to, some way that you've set things up in your world? You might, you might set up a group of people who kind of use Germanic terminology for things, and for them to use a German term for something might make sense, but for a group that doesn't otherwise use Germanic terminology, to suddenly pick a German word for jargon for one of their things doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it makes even less sense if they do, like, this word's German, and this word's Italian, and this word's Greek, and this word's Japanese, and this word's Chinese, and this word's Russian. And then it's just kind of a mishmash, and the poor reader is, like, going to be like, "Oh no, another term to memorize." So, question number 2. Is the reason behind it justified by the plot, or the characters, or the setting, or even the thematic elements that you put into the story? If so, then sure, it can go in there. If it really, if you're writing a story where you're actually, like, doing something that involves, a meaningful reference to several books of the Bible, then by all means use those names, right? But if you're just making alien, what is effectively an alien invasion story, maybe not, right? Question number 3. Is this jargon, when you see this jargon, is it organic? Is it supported by context or by a definition somewhere nearby? Is that done early on, like, the first introduction of the jargon especially? If so, then it might be more useful to put it there, right? And if it's not, then that might be something to do, right? If you're going to mention something, one of the things that they always told me when I was writing a scientific paper, right, is that you're going to use a bunch of acronyms. Of course you are, right? If you're going to use an acronym, the first time you use an acronym, you use the word, and then you put the acronym in parentheses. Simple, right? It's kind of that way with jargon, too. The first time jargon gets used, you should have a definition for it. There are exceptions for cases where you want to show that your character is kind of a fish out of water, right? Like, he walks into a room and everyone speaks Greek at him, and he's like, "Uh-oh, I don't know what any of this means. Uh-oh," right? That would be a reason to leave the context out temporarily. But generally speaking, you're going to want to put that in relatively early on. Maybe even a little bit earlier on than the character is aware of it. The reason for that is so that the reader can get acclimated to it slower and sooner, as opposed to having a bunch of confusion where he's sharing the confusion of the character, but if he has just a little bit less confusion in the character, then it can help him understand what's going on a little bit sooner, which is always a nice thing, because then when the character realizes what's going on, the reader's like, "That's right," So that's another thing to think about. Question number 4. How much am I asking the reader to memorize? This is, of course, going to be a very subjective thing, but generally speaking, if you are asking the reader to memorize a lot of things, right, you're going to make it so that the reader goes slower and gets irritated more easily as you go through. If you are judicious and you use one term here and one term here and one term here and 2 terms here, and you ease the reader into the things and you use them repeatedly in such a way that it's easier for the reader to memorize them, right? When you're talking about the thing, you talk about it for a little while, and you have maybe a paragraph where you use the term a couple of times, have some context, have someone speak up about it and say, "Oh, this is the way that I do this kind of thing with regards to this jargon term," whatever it happens to be. If you're asking the reader to memorize a lot, then kind of handhold a little bit so that they see by repetition a little bit and say, "Oh, okay, now I've got this term down," before you start introducing a bunch more. And on the other hand, if you're just kind of using terms for if you're using terms in a way that they're kind of throwaway, which is not necessarily a bad thing, right? If you're writing a story about a guy who designs missiles, and he has like a bunch of different names for all the different types of missiles that he designs, and some of those names are just plucked out of German or Greek or Russian or Chinese or whatever, right? And Kenyan, what, I don't know, right? You can have those all kind of be throwaway terms. Like he's like, "Oh, this is the Borscht missile," or "This is the Wiener Schnitzel missile," right? And they're absurd examples, but you get my point that it doesn't really matter that much to the reader what the exact type of missile is so much, for most of them, because they're just like throwaway terms that this guy named things after because he was whimsical, right? And the final question that at least I have for now for the writer to ask himself is, can I simplify or make things easier to read? Can I add more context? Can I introduce something earlier? Can I have a character explain something to another character who doesn't know what the first character is talking about? Can I have someone bring these things in an organic way so that the reader feels that there's really good flow, even though you're defining a term? There's a good reason behind it. It's important to what's happening currently in the story. The character who's talking about it understands that he's talking to someone who doesn't understand it, and therefore he's a little bit more gentle with his terminology, a little bit more reserved with excess jargon kind of thing. Make it easy for the reader to understand. Make it easier for the reader to read it, right? In a mechanical sense, right? No one has to stop and over here kind of thing. The definitions are close to the first use of the jargon kind of thing. And if you ask yourself all these questions, and you think about the different classifications of jargon, and you make sure that everything that's in there is, necessary, or at least adds some interesting flavor that's, that's like part of the setting in a meaningful way, then you're going to do all right, right? So, that's kind of my advice to writers as far as how to handle jargon and how to not overwhelm your reader. And then I also wanted to say a couple of questions that you might ask yourself as a reader when you're looking at something that has jargon in it. For instance, question one that I wrote down here is the jargon slowing me down? Am I stopping to think about it, or am I like reading it and getting it by context at that time, getting an explanation nearby? Is it slowing me down? Is it making me break my flow of reading? Is it annoying me, I guess is another way to put it. Question two, do the thematic elements of the jargon actually fit? Is it actually something that fits in, or is it something that seems like it was added just for the sake of adding it, right? And then also I thought, like, what jargon do I actually need to remember, and which can I just kind of let slide by? As I was talking about the example of the guy who's naming a bunch of different missile designs, if you're reading and you see something and you're like, I probably will never need to see this again, I probably will never need to see this again, I probably will never need to see this again, then just let it go, right? And just don't break up your enjoyment and reading of the story to chase down the etymology of random terminology that only gets used once in the story and never gets explained. So, as a reader, look for good uses of jargon and appreciate them, right? And look for bad or clumsy or dissonant uses of jargon, and think about how you would rather see it done, or think about, like, maybe there's a mnemonic or like an idea that you can use to kind of bring things together, or in the extreme case, maybe just try to get a good feel for which jargon you can ignore and which jargon you should try to remember. I don't know. That's my aside on jargon. It got a little bit longer than I thought it was going to be, but hopefully this is a little bit useful for people who are are writing and inevitably end up using some jargon. And hopefully it's also useful for people who are reading and trying to judge the reading that they're doing as well. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Currently reading Foundation and Empire. Going to kind of talk about some stuff from my upcoming book soon as well. And we'll be talking a bit more about Dune. There's a video that I want to talk about that's like talking about Dune and Tolkien and why Tolkien kind of didn't like Dune. And I haven't watched the video yet, but I'm planning on it. And once I've done that, I'll link you guys to the video and I'll talk a little bit about my reactions, and you can go see that too, and maybe you'll find that interesting as well. So with that, I'll say thanks again. It's Thursday, so this will probably be the last video for the week, because I'll be pretty busy tomorrow actually. But yeah, have a good rest of your week, have a good weekend, and I will see you next time with some more writing fun goofiness. Anyway, have a good one.